Thanks for the introduction. As Katie was saying, I'm on the board of the InnerSource Commons as director and treasurer, and my role at the BBC is a principal software engineer. So I'm going to be talking to you about some of my experiences at the BBC in the kind of open source industry engagement and an inner source space. When I'm talking about the inner source and open source virtuous cycle, I'm talking about how inner source learns from open source and how open source then can be enabled by inner source. So my role at the BBC, or at least my history at the BBC, I've been there for coming on for 12 years now, and most of that has been working on the connected TV apps. Before moving to this sort of inner source and open source role. But when you work on TV devices, your office ends up looking like this, because there are a lot of different TVs on the market, a lot of different set-top boxes and streaming devices. So wanting to make sure that your apps work on all of them, you get an office that ends up very full of TVs. But before I talk about my particular experience, I want to talk a bit about the history of technology at the BBC. So a lot of people, I think especially outside the UK, might only know us as sort of a media company, as a production company. So we don't just do the news and Doctor Who. So every time I go to a conference or something, people are surprised to meet a software engineer from the BBC. People assume we outsource all of our software, but both in the kind of internet space and also the broadcast space, we have a lot of technologists. We build the vast majority of our software in-house. So that's one of the motivations for doing stuff like this, as well as to share what we're doing as a tech company and not just a media company. And we've always been a tech company really since our beginnings in the early 20th century, and the way we approach technology needs to be in line with our mission, values, and public purpose. So again, for people not based in the UK, the BBC is a public service broadcaster. It's funded by public money via a license fee. So kind of works like a tax, but it's technically not a tax. So we're in this kind of strange middle ground of not quite public service, because we are independent of the government, but we are publicly funded. So with that in mind, our mission needs to reflect the fact that we're here to serve the British public, and this idea of inform, educate, and entertain it's kind of come through, I think, every time we sort of reword our mission. That's kind of what our founder kind of really focused towards, and we kind of take those principles through into our approach to technology, not just to our media output. So this goes back all the way to the 1930s. So back then, radio microphones were very expensive, so it's costing the BBC and therefore the British public a lot of money in terms of hardware. So the BBC worked with a company called Marconi to develop their own microphone that would be, by developing it in-house, it saved a lot of money, and also was able to be built to our specifications. And then over the years, this model was iterated on. And if you watch any kind of British period dramas, you might spot this microphone in any kind of broadcasting scenes. Jumping ahead 50 years to the age of computing, we put out a computer called the BBC Micro. So this was produced by a company called Acorn, and this was part of a project called the Computer Literacy Project in the 1980s. And these computers were distributed to schools all over the UK. And I know when I was at school in the 90s, we still had one of these in every classroom. And I sort of started my early years of programming working in BBC Basic on machines like this. Moving forward to sort of this century and open source specifically, this is a slide that one of my colleagues did. So in true open source fashion, I'm reusing his work. But yeah, he went back into the Wayback Machine and found out that the BBC had an open source website way back in 2005. So again, since the early days of the internet, we've had an online presence, and really, acting as a technology company, not just a media company. Moving to more recent history, we had the Microbit initiative. So this was kind of developed by BBC R&D along with some other partners, and eventually spun out into an independent non-profit in 2016. But this was kind of the spiritual successor to the BBC Micro. This was a small, very small computer, similar to a Raspberry Pi, but smaller and cheaper, and distributed to again UK schools to aid in education. And then present day, as I say, we still have an open source. Presence. If you want to learn more, you can go to the bbc.co.uk/open source website. And R&D in particular are worth shouting out. So I work in the kind of audience-facing applications side of the BBC, but our R&D technologists are probably further ahead in terms of open source and industry engagement than we are, and they do some great work contributing to open standards, both in terms of broadcasting and web. So coming back to my personal experiences, 11 and a half years ago when I joined, I didn't really understand what open source was. I just thought of it as free software. So, I had to play with Linux because it was a free alternative to Windows. I used OpenOffice because I didn't want to pay for Microsoft Office, but I didn't really understand that it was kind of this community-driven, collaboratively developed thing. And it was only when I joined the BBC that I started to learn about open source. And the first project that I worked on was a project called the TV Application Layer, or TAL. So this was a framework for building TV applications on browser-based TV applications, and that made me understand that actually, it's not just kind of software being developed for free. There are reasons that people do this, and I think it's interesting to take a look at the reasons why the BBC does open source and TAL in particular. So strategic. So I mentioned this was a sort of a framework for building web-based applications. So in the early days of smart TV development, there was multiple different platforms. We had so this was slightly before my time, but we had to have multiple versions of our video on demand service to cater for the fact that there was multiple different TVs. We had to build multiple apps. So we wanted to kind of drive the industry towards open web standards. So that meant that we could build one version of our streaming application. And it also meant that other TV app developers, whether they used TAL or not, could build their TV applications on the open web standards. And we're still mostly on open web standards in terms of our TV apps. So that seems to have been a success from that point of view. Whether the industry would have gone that way anyway, I couldn't say. But it's certainly, that was the intent. One of the intentions with TAL. Partnerships as well. So we work closely with TV manufacturers on our TV apps, and a really good example from TAL is with the 2014 and 2015 Samsung TVs. They for a period of time they could only play live streams kind of at the live point. So you couldn't pause live content or rewind live content, play the episode from the start or anything like that. But Samsung made a big code contribution to TAL that enabled their 2014-2015 devices to have that fully featured live experience. So that was a massive audience benefit. And those devices are still in use today and still have that advanced live capability thanks to TAL and thanks to open source, essentially. Recruitment and retention, yeah. I I might have moved on after 12 years if I didn't get the opportunity to do things like this. Get involved in the industry, learn from other companies through industry engagement and open source. And we hear it, during recruitment. When we're recruiting people, we always get the odd person who will mention open source or our activities in the community as a motivator for applying. Public remit. So as I said, inform, educate, entertain. We as a publicly funded organisation should be giving something back to the public, to the industry that we're a part of. We're not full public money, public code. I think, I'm sure many people believe that we should be, but whether we get there one day, I couldn't say. But we do at least want to give some stuff back, even if we don't feel at the moment that we can make all of our code public. And contributing back, kind of the same sort of thing. We want to be good open source citizens. We don't want to just build all of our software on this great available open source and not give anything back to the wider software industry. And finally, internal collaboration, and that's where we can start talking about InnerSource. So what we found with TAL and with some other open source projects, we found that this unlocked collaboration with other BBC teams. As I say, we got engagement with TAL from TV manufacturers and other TV app developers, but we also got collaboration with other BBC teams. So that kind of made us think, well, why does the code have to be open source to enable this internal collaboration? What is it about kind of proprietary software within an organization that results in these silos and lack of collaboration? So we sort of looked at the sort of things that work in the open source world and tried to apply these to our proprietary internal software. So we thought that based on learning from open source, it seemed to be framed around these ideas of community, adoption, contribution, and transparency. And implemented a lot of these values into our private software to enable kind of what we called at the time open development to aid that cross-team collaboration. One example of us learning from open source and applying it internally is the 0MQ C4. So this is the 0MQ's project's guidelines on how to interact with contributors, and a really interesting part of it that jumped out to us was this idea that sort of maintainers and trusted committers should work with contributors to kind of merge incorrect patches. So we see this in open source all the time, where somebody perhaps inexperienced or unfamiliar with a project opens a pull request and it will get shot down for whatever reason. But with 0MQ, what they strive for is to actually onboard contributors and work with them to make that merge request actually something that can be pulled in. And this is a great investment because it helps onboard contributors. It makes them feel appreciated for their contribution. It is, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of time investment, but that's an investment that they feel is worth having, and we in our InnerSource feel is worth having. Another example of where we learnt from open source is with the RFCs from the Rust programming language. So this is a way for the Rust community to openly discuss sort of big technical decisions that are being made in Rust. So again, we kind of took this template, modified it a bit for our internal use, but this enables us to kind of have transparent cross-team decision making by learning from the open source community. And then, yeah, as we went down this open development path to increase collaboration in our internal software, we realized that what we were doing was InnerSource, and we found this community, the InnerSource Commons. We've since I've been working with the InnerSource Commons, I've seen other companies going through similar journeys. They might call it social coding or internal open source. So we called it open development, but we're all talking about InnerSource essentially. And actually, an interesting side note for me personally is being involved in InnerSource Commons has made me better at open source, because the InnerSource Commons works as an open source community essentially. So things like our website and our patterns, our learning path content is all open source on GitHub. And also given me an insight into how non-profit foundations work. So yeah, it's been sort of almost like a mini virtuous cycle for me in that regard. So yeah, and another thing that I think is interesting from seeing how other companies come to InnerSource is there seems to be two different avenues. You have companies like the BBC who already did open source and realized that we wanted to get the benefits of open source for our internal software. And then there are other companies who don't do open source, but realize that there's benefit to be had by adopting open source practices internally. Sometimes that is with an intention to then open source in future, but sometimes those companies are just doing it to increase their productivity and their efficiency and build better software. So I can't remember if this pull request has been merged yet, but there's an open pull request on our on the InnerSource Commons website to talk about our 2025 goals. And yeah, this kind of definition of InnerSource I think is interesting to think about in the context I was saying, where different companies kind of approach it from different angles, and also the qualitative benefits. So, as I say, a lot of companies are doing this to get better collaboration internally, get better efficiency, better code reuse. And then some companies are doing this consciously as a pathway to open source. In terms of the definition, I talked about all these practices that we've learned from open source. Things like the kind of merge incorrect patches, things like have your decision making transparent through something like an RFC. So the definition of InnerSource, at least from our point of view at the BBC, is that it's not just having it on a single GitHub instance or GitLab instance that's open to everyone at the company. You need to have these other practices implemented to enable collaboration. So yeah, learning from open source is how we were able to do great InnerSource. Yeah, the InnerSource patterns is another great example of this. So looking at the InnerSource patterns, if you haven't looked at these, I would highly recommend it. There's loads of really interesting content on how companies are implementing InnerSource. And this again reflects this idea that we are taking learnings from open source and applying them internally. So I talked about how the BBC uses RFCs, and we contributed that as a pattern, and we found other companies again observing RFCs in the open source world and applying them internally. Some other examples of patterns that mirror open source is standard base documentation. So, README, contributing MD, these are files that have been commonplace in open source projects for decades. And what companies implementing InnerSource have found is that if you do that to InnerSource projects, it helps InnerSource as well. Common requirements is another one. If you open source something that is very specific to your particular use case in your company, then that's not really going to get much traction. So yeah, in the open source world, like the software tends to be successful if it is solving a common problem that multiple people are experiencing. And the same is true for InnerSource. If your InnerSource project is only solving your immediate team's problems, then it's probably not going to be adopted or contributed to by other teams in your organization. So yeah, once again, InnerSource mirroring open source, and even just kind of relatively simple things like remember to say thank you, right? Again, we've kind of seen successful open source communities where they value their contributors and recognize their contributions, and the same is true for InnerSource. Even though it's different because you are getting paid to do InnerSource. I mean, for some companies, you have to volunteer your time, and you might not get the recognition. But what companies involved in the InnerSource Commons have found is that, yeah, much like in the open source world, like people appreciate recognition and thanks, and that will encourage contributors to come back and keep contributing. And the final pattern that I think is interesting to see how InnerSource has learned from open source is one that is not yet published on the InnerSource patterns book. It's currently in the initial phase. I think we are actually doing some work to get this kind of verified and moved into the book. But yeah, this idea of governance levels and how an InnerSource project might be only open for bug reports and issues, or it might be open for larger contributions, or it might even be seeking kind of fully shared ownership. So this is interesting. Again, in the open source world, we see some projects might be reluctant to take on contributions, but will take bug reports and issues, or they might take larger contributions, or they might go for sort of a fully shared model where it might be an equal partnership amongst a number of companies. It might be donated to a non-profit foundation. So again, there's this mirroring in terms of how InnerSource is governed and how open source is governed. But going back to the BBC specifically, or TV apps in the BBC specifically, I thought it'd be interesting to have a look at our governance principles for maintainers of InnerSource. So yeah, you're responsible for the health of the InnerSource project. You have to have domain expertise. So yeah, you need to understand kind of what you're maintaining. It's around teams, not individuals. So we don't want the kind of single point of failure. Again, in the open source world, it's always a risk if an open source project is only being looked after by one or two key contributors or maintainers. Support contributions from other interested party rather than doing all the work in the team, avoiding bottlenecks. So yeah, this is one of the key things about InnerSource. Yeah, if you're looking after an InnerSource project, then you do need to invest in your contributors. Don't just do all the work yourself, otherwise you're not getting the benefit of InnerSource. And finally, and this is where we loop back around to how, for us, we've seen InnerSource benefiting our approach to open source, is you also need to be responsible for open source in the domain that you're working in. So for us, that means that if you are the maintainers of an InnerSource project or an open source project in the TV apps at the BBC, then it's kind of the same responsibilities. So as I was saying, you need to look after your contributors. You need to maintain the health of the project. You need to have the domain expertise. So we've got a couple of examples of TV libraries. So talked about TAL earlier. That's been deprecated now. Web development's kind of moved on a lot, but we're working towards open sourcing some more libraries to aid with TV development. And thanks to our InnerSource approach, when we open sourced these, it was just a matter of essentially getting legal sign off and adding a license. Thanks to InnerSource, we already had all the documentation in place and all the processes in place that the teams could adopt to give advice, take on contributions, be transparent about their decision making. So yeah, I said before, like InnerSource isn't always with the intent of going to open source, but for us, it really helped us open source. And because of those governance principles I was talking about, this gives me confidence that when we open source more of our TV code, there shouldn't be this risk of projects being abandoned, ignored, or unmaintained, which is always a risk in open source and in the source. But because we've got those governance models, those governance models will apply as our TV libraries go open source as well. And then on the other side of how InnerSource has helped us do open source, so because our teams and our developers are working in this sort of pull request, async communication, collaborative way, it means that they have the skills they need to do open source. So in the kind of audience-facing teams at the BBC, we've not always been the best at actually contributing upstream to our dependencies. But we've been working on getting processes in place to enable that. And this was an example of one of the first contributions we made once we rolled out these processes. But our developers had the skills they needed to do this. And it might even be stuff that seems really, really simple. Like those of us who are experienced in open source and InnerSource kind of understand the difference between forks and branches, understand how to make a fork or a branch in order to raise a pull request. But what we found over the years, as we were adopting InnerSource in the TV apps, a lot of people just didn't know how to do that. They might be worried about, if I fork this BBC project, this internal BBC project, will that make it public? Actually getting those skills, understanding forking, branching, pull requests, and also the soft skills around written code reviews, async communication, all of that is a key enabler for getting those developers comfortable with doing open source contributions. Doing InnerSource contributions is probably a little bit less intimidating because if there's some kind of problem with that interaction, you can raise it with people's managers or HR. Hopefully it doesn't come to that, but there's still that higher confidence that you're going to get a positive interaction with InnerSource, and it gives a nice, safer learning environment for those processes. Hopefully I've kind of shown how open source informs InnerSource. So we learn how to do InnerSource by looking at what works in open source, and then InnerSource itself enables more open source by getting projects ready to be open sourced and getting developers ready to work in the open source. So in general, InnerSource and open source encourage a virtuous cycle of collaborative culture. And I think there's some few more examples of kind of this collaborative culture that's interesting. So I talked before about how before we were doing InnerSource, before we were doing open source, there wasn't that ability to collaborate across BBC teams, but we now have R&D contributing directly into our production code rather than kind of prototyping elsewhere and then having to have a cost further down the line to get that more experimental code into the production code. Another really good example of how R&D have helped us is, as I say, that R&D are further down the line in terms of their open source engagement, so they were able to help us get the upstream contribution process over the line. Another example of collaborative culture, so our security champions in the BBC, which is our security champions, is like an internal network of software engineers who want to not necessarily specialize in security, but add that expertise and be be local representatives for secure code in their teams. So the security champions came across this article about some risks with making previously private projects on GitHub going public, and how you may think you've deleted your data, but actually you can retrieve it. And the security champions, rather than just kind of keeping that within the security champions, they collaborated with the open source champions. And between us, we were able to put together some guidelines. And again, that's just a great example of collaborative culture, going beyond just code contributions. So yeah, just coming back to the 2025 goals and the qualitative benefits of InnerSource. So hopefully I've demonstrated that one of the qualitative benefits of InnerSource is enabling open source and enabling the InnerSource and open source virtuous cycle. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.